Broken soldier boy. That's what the teenager said. That's what they all laughed at. 3 of them, maybe 4, it was hard to count when their voices overlapped into one cruel chorus that echoed off the Galleria's polished marble floor. Katie Morrison didn't stop pushing the wheelchair. Her hand stayed steady on the chrome handles. Her breathing didn't change. She'd heard worse in Kandahar, and she wasn't going to give children the satisfaction of watching her flinch now. James Reeves sat in the chair with his shoulders curved inward, the way paralyzed people sometimes held themselves, not from pain, but from the weight of being seen. His hands rested on the blanket across his lap, still and useless. Katie had been wheeling him through the Galleria Mall's food court every Tuesday for 6 months, always at 2:53 p.m., always on the way to his physical therapy appointment in the clinic adjacent to the mall's east entrance. The routine was deliberate. The timing was medical. But the cruelty that arrived with it was always exactly the same. The mall smelled like overcooked pretzel salt and hand sanitizer from the urgent care facility where Katie worked. Mercy General had closed its East Campus 2 years ago, and the clinic, a 12-bed urgent care operation squeezed between a Cinnabon and a Williams-Sonoma, was what remained. Katie had been nursing there since January, 6 months of downcast eyes and efficient movements, 6 months of pushing veteran patients through these corridors without making anyone uncomfortable. That had been the unspoken agreement: be helpful, be invisible, be grateful for the work. The teenagers were sitting 3 tables away from the fountain. One of them wore a college sweatshirt. Another had a phone out, filming. Katie registered the phone with the part of her brain that never fully left Kandahar, the part that knew when a camera meant documentation, meant evidence, meant someone was building a record. She'd learned to track that kind of detail in the Hindu Kush Mountains, back when recording an insurgent position meant saving 12 soldiers' lives 3 hours later. Old instincts died hard. Muscle memory was a curse that way. Look at him. Dude's like a vegetable. The college sweatshirt one. Male, approximately 19, confidence born from never having faced actual consequences. How'd you even break like that? The other kid snorted. Probably stepped on an IED like a dumbass. James's jaw tightened. Katie saw it in the mirror mounted on the pillar beside the Starbucks, his reflection, small and distant, his throat working against whatever he wanted to say. She adjusted her grip on the wheelchair handles. Still moving. Still steady. The clinic uniform she wore was khaki and forgettable, designed to blend into any institutional hallway. Her name tag read K. Morrison, RN. Nothing more. Nothing that suggested the surgical scars on her knuckles from 11 deployments, nothing that hinted at the reason her hands trembled slightly whenever she passed the military recruitment posters in the mall directory. Those trembles weren't fear. They were restraint. They were the weight of 10 years of protocol, secrecy, and the kind of silence that had become as familiar as her own breathing. Hey, wheelchair guy. You gonna wheel yourself to a hospital or something? The third one laughed, high and sharp like breaking glass. The mall shoppers did what they always did. Eyes down. Phones forward. A mother pulled her child away from the vicinity, as if paralysis was contagious. A businessman accelerated his pace. The crowd flowed around the confrontation like water around stone, and no one, not a single person among the 80 or 90 people in that food court at 2:11 on a Tuesday afternoon, said a word. That was the thing about public cruelty. It required an audience always meant accomplices. Even silence was a choice. Katie stopped the wheelchair. The motion was small and deliberate. The wheels didn't screech, she'd learned long ago how to move through spaces without announcing herself. But the cessation of movement was its own announcement. She felt the teenager's attention shift toward her, felt the sudden curiosity of a predator realizing its prey had stopped running. I need you to stop. Her voice came out calm. Not soft. Calm was different from soft. Calm was the voice of someone who'd given orders in conditions where mistakes meant body bags. Those comments. They stop now. The college sweatshirt kid turned fully in his chair, grinning like he'd just been handed permission to keep going. Oh, we got a nurse. Lady, it's a free country. We can say whatever? You can say whatever you want. Katie's hands remained on the wheelchair handles, her posture unchanged. She wasn't blocking the teenagers. Wasn't approaching them. Wasn't making herself larger or louder. She was just stating facts in the same tone she'd used to explain discharge instructions to a patient. That's correct. But you won't do it in front of this man. That stops now. The third teenager, the one filming, kept the phone up. Oh man, this is going viral. Katie turned to look at him then. Not at the phone. At his eyes. She'd learned in Kandahar that most people couldn't maintain eye contact with someone who'd actually seen things. Actual violence. Actual stakes. The world divided itself into people who could hold a gaze and people who looked away, and the teenager's eyes shifted down toward his phone screen within 2 seconds. You're documenting a moment where you had an opportunity to be decent, Katie said quietly. And you chose not to be. That's what your friends will see when they watch that. That's what you'll see when you're older and you understand what you actually did here. You might want to think about that. The college sweatshirt kid made a dismissive sound, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The other teenagers seemed smaller. One of them looked actually uncomfortable. Katie had seen this pattern before, not in malls, but in forward operating bases, in convoy vehicles, in situations where someone had introduced actual moral clarity into what had been casual cruelty. People didn't like it. It made them feel exposed. But that wasn't the worst part. That was when the man in the $3,000 suit descended the escalator from the second floor, his tie pressed sharp enough to cut, his face arranged in the expression of an administrator about to solve a problem by making it disappear. Dr. Richard Sterling, general manager of the Galleria, vice president of the mall's parent corporation, and the reason that charity donation boxes for veterans had started disappearing from store counters over the past 6 months. Katie didn't know the specifics. She was a nurse, not an accountant, but she'd worked long enough in institutional settings to recognize the specific shape of corruption, the too expensive watch, the off-duty confidence, the way security guards straightened when they saw him coming. He was moving toward them now, his shoes clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Katie felt James shift slightly in the wheelchair. Subtle. Barely perceptible. But she felt it through her hands, and she understood what it meant. Here comes the part that actually hurts. The food court fell silent when Dr. Richard Sterling emerged from his office on the second-floor landing. He moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that commanded attention, a man accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his presence. His silk tie caught the light as he descended the escalator, his gaze sweeping across the crowd with the casual assessment of someone calculating market value. Katie saw him before he saw her. Saw the trajectory of his descent like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. Sterling reached the bottom and paused, taking in the scene, the teenagers still clustered near the Starbucks counter, the scattered shoppers with their phones out, Katie standing motionless beside James Reeves's wheelchair with one hand resting on the push handle. The old soldier's knuckles were white against the armrests. What's the situation here? Sterling's voice carried the tone of a man asking a question he'd already decided the answer to. Not a request for information. A performance for the gathering audience. Katie began to explain. These young men were. I'm asking them. Sterling cut her off with a gesture, turning to the teenagers with an expression that suggested they'd just joined his country club. You gentlemen having a good day? Yeah, man, the tallest one said, recovering his smirk. Just hanging out. Exactly. Sterling's smile widened. He turned back to Katie, and his eyes narrowed in a way that made the temperature in the food court drop 10 degrees. Ms. Morrison, let's be clear about something. This is the Galleria. This is a premium shopping destination. These young men are customers. They have every right to be here. He gestured at James without looking at him. Your patient, on the other hand, is disrupting the experience we've cultivated for our premium clientele. Wheelchair traffic clogs our corridors. It creates a depressing atmosphere that impacts our retailers' bottom lines. The words landed like stones. One of the shoppers actually looked away, as if witnessing something too private to observe. "This isn't a hospital, Ms. Morrison," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to something more conversational, more dangerous. "We don't accommodate every special case that rolls through our doors. This is a place of commerce. A place where people come to feel elevated, not confronted with reminders of life's unfortunate circumstances." He glanced at the teenagers. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for your shopping experience here. You belong here far more than anyone pushing a wheelchair through a food court." Katie's jaw tightened. Just once. A single muscle working beneath her skin like a clock hand ticking forward. Sterling watched that tiny response with the intensity of a predator reading prey. He pulled his wallet from his jacket, Italian leather, probably $400, and extracted a $20 bill with the kind of flourish that demanded attention. His assistant manager, a nervous man named Derek who always seemed to be apologizing for things, materialized at his elbow. $20, Sterling announced loudly enough for 30 people to hear. He held the bill up like it was a museum piece. $20 says little Florence Nightingale here quits within the week. This is all too real for her. The wheelchair, the conflict, the moral complexity of serving people who don't matter in a space designed for people who do. He pressed the bill into Derek's hand. "She'll fold. They always do when they realize nobody actually cares about their patients." Katie's coffee cup sat on a nearby table, cooling beside a potted fern that looked like it had been watered with contempt. Sterling walked toward it with the fluid confidence of a man who'd never experienced consequences. He reached for a napkin dispenser, and in the same motion, smooth, practiced, clearly rehearsed in his mind 100 times, he swept the coffee cup across Katie's uniform. Dark liquid bloomed across her scrubs like a stain spreading through water. "Oops," Sterling said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He pressed a handful of napkins into her hand, leaning close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that couldn't mask the underneath smell of it all, that particular odor of a man rotting from the inside. "Clean yourself up, sweetheart. You look like you've been through something." The endearment hung in the air like a slap. Sweet-voiced. Poisonous. Katie's hand came up automatically, wiping the tear that had escaped down her cheek without breaking eye contact. Not a trembling hand. Not a flinching face. Not a voice that cracked or wavered or showed anything remotely like the emotion Sterling was clearly hoping to trigger. Her eyes were steady as surgical steel as she looked directly at him, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the marble floor with the kind of clarity that made shoppers stop mid-stride. "A man who fought for your freedom sits 3 feet from you," Katie said, each word deliberate and precise. "And you choose cruelty. That tells me everything about who you are, Dr. Sterling." The silence that followed was the kind you could operate in. The kind that had weight and presence. Sterling's smile remained fixed, but something flickered behind his eyes, a flash of something that looked almost like fear before he buried it under layers of institutional certainty. His hand moved to adjust his tie, a nervous tell he probably didn't even realize he had. "And your employment here," he said, recovering his tone but unable to recover his advantage, "tells me everything about you. File your complaint with HR if you'd like." He turned and walked away, moving faster than he descended the escalator, his assistant manager hurrying to keep pace. Katie stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds, then she turned to James Reeves and gripped the wheelchair handles. "Let's go, sir," she said quietly. The old soldier's hand reached up, found hers on the handle, and squeezed once. Hard. The kind of grip that carried decades of understanding, the weight of being dismissed, of being treated as an obstacle, of being invisible except as a target for cruelty. But also something else. Recognition. The knowledge of being seen by someone who actually looked. But that wasn't the worst part. Katie pushed James toward the clinic exit while coffee dripped from her sleeve, while shoppers averted their eyes and returned to their shopping, while Sterling watched from the upper level with his assistant manager and made a calculation about how long it would take for the inconvenient nurse to disappear from his operation. The teenagers near the Starbucks had already lost interest, drifting back to their conversation, the entire encounter absorbed and discarded like a piece of entertainment with no lasting value. Katie didn't sleep that night. She lay in her apartment at 3:36 a.m., staring at the ceiling of her one-bedroom in a part of Houston where the rent stayed cheap and the neighbors stayed quiet. Her scrub sat in a pile on the bathroom floor, coffee-stained and ruined. She'd have to replace them before her shift the next day. She'd have to show up and pretend Sterling's words hadn't landed in that specific place where she'd spent 6 months trying to build a life that didn't require remembering who she used to be. By 6:15 a.m., she'd showered. By 6:16 a.m., she was wearing fresh scrubs. By 7:56 a.m., she was pushing a medication cart through the clinic corridors of the mall, moving like nothing had changed, nothing had broken, nothing had fundamentally shifted in the way she'd have to carry herself through the world. The shift was quiet until 11:53 a.m. That's when the screaming started. Not the polite screams of someone who dropped their shopping bags. The deep, panicked screams of something critical going wrong. Katie's head came up from the patient file she'd been reviewing. The sound came from the direction of the central fountain, the 3-story atrium water feature that anchored the mall's geography and drew foot traffic like blood drew sharks. She moved before consciously deciding to move. Muscle memory. The part of her that had spent 8 years responding to crisis in a desert where the sand itself seemed to want to kill you didn't bother asking permission from the part of her that was trying to be just a nurse. The crowd was already forming when Katie reached the fountain court. A man, mid-70s, lay on the tile in that particular angle that meant his nervous system had simply stopped participating. His shirt was unbuttoned. His left chest was rising noticeably more than his right. His lips had that specific blue-gray color that meant the oxygen in his blood was dropping like a stone down a well. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space. His lung collapsing. His trachea deviating. Ticking clock running at full speed. Call 911, Katie shouted to the crowd, already moving into position. Someone stammered something about an ambulance, ETA, 12 minutes. 12 minutes. The man had 3. Maybe 4 if his cardiovascular system wanted to be generous, and right now it looked like it was done negotiating. Dr. Sterling pushed through the crowd, his presence making the air feel heavier, more constrained. He knelt beside the man with the confident posture of someone who'd never actually had to do anything, his hands hovering in the space where actual medical knowledge would go. Katie was already reaching for the first aid station mounted on the pillar, one of the mall's small concessions to the possibility that humans sometimes required emergency care in commercial spaces. She opened it with hands that had steadied 1,000 times before. The supplies inside were standard, basic, designed for cuts and minor trauma. Not for tension pneumothorax. But she'd worked with less. He needs needle decompression, Katie said, her voice dropping into a register that didn't leave room for negotiation. Now. You can't perform procedures on mall property without authorization. Sterling's protest came out strangled, as if he was watching something he didn't understand unfold and couldn't stop it. Katie ignored him the way you ignore wind. She identified the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into muscle memory from 8 years of doing this in conditions that made a shopping mall look like a surgical suite. She used an oxygen key from the kit, the kind meant for administration, as a makeshift needle guide. 1 breath. The puncture. Controlled. The hiss. That specific sound of air escaping from a collapsed pleural space. The sound of a lung re-expanding. The sound of a man whose oxygen levels were climbing, 72. 78, 84. 91. Sterling stood frozen 6 feet away, useless and aware of his uselessness in a way that probably wounded him more than any physical injury could have. A mall security guard stood nearby, phone in hand, looking between Katie and Sterling like he was trying to decide who actually had authority in a moment where authority had clearly defaulted to the person doing the work. Katie maintained pressure, monitored vitals, tracked the color returning to the man's lips. By the time the paramedics arrived, 7 minutes later, faster than dispatch had promised, the old man's breathing had stabilized. His eyes were open. He was conscious. The lead paramedic, a woman named Chen with the kind of efficient movements that came from actual experience, watched Katie's hand positioning and technique for exactly 2 seconds before something changed in her expression. "You've done that before," Chen said quietly, kneeling to take over the assessment. "Combat medic." Katie gathered her supplies in silence and stood. Her coffee-stained scrubs from yesterday had been replaced with fresh ones, but Sterling's presence hung in the space like a smell, like something that wouldn't wash out. The crowd began to applaud as the paramedics loaded the man into the ambulance, his condition stable, his life extended by the simple fact that one person in that mall had known what to do when the moment demanded it. Shoppers clapped. Teenagers paused their conversations. For exactly 30 seconds, Katie had become visible in a way that mattered. Sterling's expression had turned to ice. The elderly man collapsed near the marble fountain at 2:43 p.m. on a Tuesday, his body crumpling like wet paper between 2 potted palms. Katie was passing through the food court with a nutrition chart for James Reeves when she heard the sound, not a scream, but the absence of one. A body hitting tile. The crowd's collective intake of breath. She was 30 feet away. She covered that distance in under 4 seconds. The man was gasping. Not breathing, gasping. His skin had turned the color of wet concrete, and Katie could see what others couldn't, the way his chest moved wrong, asymmetrical, the left side barely rising while the right heaved desperately against collapsing lung tissue. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, crushing his heart with every breath. He had minutes. Maybe less. "Call 911, Katie said to the nearest shopper. Not a request. A command. Her voice had changed already, dropping an octave, losing the deferential softness she wore like a uniform. "Tell them male, 70s, acute respiratory distress. I'm performing needle decompression." She ran to the mall's first aid station, mounted on the wall near the bathroom corridor, the kind that collected dust in most buildings. Her hands moved without hesitation. She grabbed the emergency kit, tore it open, found what she needed, a 14-gauge needle, the kind designed for exactly this. Her fingers felt the man's ribs, counted down from the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Anatomy that lived in her muscle memory like a second language. The needle went in at a precise 45-degree angle. There was resistance, then a hiss, the sound of air escaping under pressure, the pneumothorax decompressing like a tire valve opening. She felt it more than heard it, the tiny rush of relief that meant his heart was no longer being crushed. "Oxygen," she said to a security guard frozen 10 feet away. "There's a tank in the clinic." "Now." The man's color changed almost immediately. The desperation left his eyes. His breathing steadied from panic gasping to something almost normal. Katie kept her hand on the needle, keeping it patent, her other hand checking his pulse at the carotid artery. Strong. Fast, but strong. Paradoxical as it seemed, the worst of the crisis had passed. He wasn't stable, far from it, but he wasn't dying in front of 200 mall shoppers anymore. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. Katie briefed them with the precision of someone who'd done this in convoy trucks and field tents across Kandahar province. 73-year-old male, acute pneumothorax, needle decompression performed at 14-gauge, second intercostal space midclavicular. Breath sounds returned bilaterally. Stable vitals for the last 6 minutes. Suspect blunt trauma, he mentioned chest pain before collapse. One of the paramedics, a woman named Rivera with kind eyes and practiced hands, looked at Katie with something approaching awe. "You got here fast." "I was already here," Katie said simply. She watched them load the man onto the stretcher, watched them secure the needle with tape and professional efficiency, watched them wheel him toward the ambulance while the crowd dispersed back to their shopping and their coffee like the moment hadn't just rewritten someone's entire future. A man who was going to die was instead going to live. Because of something she did. Because of what she knew. That was when Dr. Richard Sterling emerged from the crowd. He'd been watching. Standing near the north entrance, coffee in hand, that expression of calculated detachment on his face. But something had shifted in him during those 8 minutes. Something had hardened. He watched the paramedics load the man, watched Katie step back into the crowd, and then his jaw clenched in a way that looked less like concern and more like calculation. Katie saw it. She didn't react. She simply turned back toward the clinic corridor to continue her afternoon, her composure like armor, nothing broken on the surface. But she'd learned to read that particular expression in men, the kind of expression that came right before consequences arrived. Sterling made his first call at 3:15 p.m. from his office, the door locked, his voice low and precise through the phone line. "Gerald, it's Richard. Listen, we have a situation with liability. An unauthorized medical procedure was performed on mall property this afternoon. One of the clinic nurses." "No, not a doctor. That's exactly why it's a problem. She performed a needle decompression, yes, exactly what I said, needle decompression, on a civilian without proper credentials." "Amham. I understand. That's what I thought too. Yes, I have documentation. Her name and everything." The second call came at 3:53 p.m. to the director of Mercy General, Katie's official employer. Sterling's voice took on a different texture, less confident, more calculated. "Dr. Morrison in administration? This is Richard Sterling with Mall Security. I need to report a concerning incident involving one of your clinic nurses. She performed unauthorized medical procedures on private property." "No, she's not a doctor. I understand the implications." "Exactly. I believe it creates significant liability exposure for the hospital. I think you'll want to address this before it escalates. Happy to send documentation." The third call came at 4:12 p.m. to a number Katie had listed on her employment file, a reference from a previous supervisor. Sterling's voice became almost conversational, almost friendly. The kind of tone predators used when they were fishing. "Hi, I'm trying to reach someone who can speak to Katie's judgment and professional stability. I'm doing a background verification. There's been a situation here that has me concerned. Nothing concrete yet, but her judgment in a medical situation today raises some questions. Any history of instability? Overstepping boundaries? Amham. I see. And this was during her military service, you said? Interesting. Yes, thank you. This has been very helpful." Sterling's fourth call went to his attorney, voice clipped and efficient. "Draft a wrongful practice letter. Address it to Mercy General, CC Katie Morrison. Emphasize liability, unauthorized medical procedures, practicing medicine without license. Make it clear that the mall's insurance will not cover incidents resulting from unauthorized personnel performing medical interventions. Amham. Today. I want it in their inbox before 5 p.m. By 4:43 p.m., Katie's direct supervisor at the clinic called her into the small back office, the one that smelled of antiseptic and bad decisions. Dr. Patel looked exhausted, the way people looked when they'd been caught between two forces and had to pick a side that wouldn't destroy them. "You saved that man's life," Dr. Patel said quietly. "Everyone here is saying the same thing. You did everything right." "But," Katie said. She could hear the "but" coming from 1,000 miles away. "But Sterling is threatening a lawsuit. He's saying you practice medicine without authority. That the hospital is liable. I've already had 3 calls, the board, our insurance carrier, our legal counsel. They're all saying the same thing, keep you off mall property until this resolves. I hate this. You understand I hate this. But I need you to stay away from the mall outside the clinic. Come directly here, complete your hours, leave directly from the clinic. No time in the public areas. It's only temporary until this blows over." Katie nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply nodded the way soldiers did when orders were given, when the decision was already made and words were just noise on top of it. At 6:04 p.m., Dr. Sterling personally walked into the clinic with a property ban notice, the kind printed on official letterhead and signed with legal authority. He handed it to Katie in front of 3 other nurses, the kind of timing that made sure they all saw it, all understood what it meant. Effective immediately, Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil over water. You're banned from mall property. Liability concerns. Security will escort you out if you're found in the public areas. He smiled then, the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. Safer for everyone that way. Katie took the notice. She read it once. Her composure held like a dam holds water, tight, contained, showing nothing. But what that notice really said was, I know who you are, and I'm going to bury you before you bury me. That evening, Katie stood at Marcus Morrison's grave in Houston Memorial Gardens, rain hammering down like applause for a performance nobody was watching. The granite stone was cold under her palms, her late husband's name weathered by 3 years of Texas sun and guilt she couldn't seem to wash away. Marcus Morrison. 1982 to 2021, Marine. Beloved. She knelt in the mud, her scrub soaking through at the knees, her hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The rain fell harder, pounding the headstone like judgment, like accusation. I promised you, she whispered, her voice breaking in a way it hadn't broken since she'd learned to survive. I promised you I'd keep fighting for them. I promised I'd honor what you died for. And I couldn't even last a year. I failed you. I failed James. I failed that man today by being in the wrong place with the wrong credentials. Thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant artillery, the kind of sound that lived in her bones whether she wanted it there or not. She pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the one Marcus had given her before her last deployment, embroidered with the Special Forces insignia, worn soft by a decade of being sewn against her chest under layers of uniform and armor and careful distance. She pressed it against the wet granite, holding it there as if it could somehow bridge the gap between the person she'd been and the person she was trying so hard to become. I can't do this anymore, she whispered to the stone, to the rain, to the ghost that lived in the space where her husband used to be. I can't be her anymore. I don't know how to go back. But that wasn't quite true. The problem wasn't going back. The problem was that going forward had become impossible, and staying still meant drowning, and Dr. Sterling had just made sure she had nowhere left to go at all. The ban came 48 hours later. Sterling had that kind of power, the kind that didn't need explanation, just letterhead and a lawyer's phone number. The mall's general manager sent it through the clinic's administrative email at 6:11 a.m., before anyone was in the building. Liability concerns. Unauthorized medical practice on private property. Effective immediately. Security escort required for removal of personal items. Katie read it 3 times, standing alone in the break room with cold coffee in her hands, waiting for the words to change. They didn't. By 9:15 a.m., 2 mall security officers were waiting at the clinic entrance. They weren't unkind about it, that was almost worse. Professional. Efficient. One of them, a younger man with the kind of rehearsed sympathy that came from years of escorting people out of places, held a cardboard box. Dr. Sterling said you could take personal effects. We'll need to walk you out through the main entrance. Not asking. Stating facts the way people do when they've been given instructions and are following them to the letter. Katie's hands moved through the motions without her mind directing them. Her spare scrubs from the locker. The coffee mug her sister had given her, chipped on one side. A framed photo of Mercy General's nursing staff from the orientation week 6 months ago. Was it only 6 months? The memories compressed themselves, accordion folded into something small enough to fit in that box. Her badge clattered against the bottom, the laminated photo of her face looking up at nothing, her smile from a time when she'd still believed disappearing meant safety. The walk through the mall felt like moving through someone else's nightmare. The clinic was adjacent to the Galleria's main atrium, which meant the security escort would cut through the food court at 9:41 a.m., right as the mid-morning crowd swelled, mothers with strollers, elderly couples window shopping, teenagers filming content for social media. Katie kept her eyes forward. The box was heavy for something so empty. Her scrubs were still damp from the escort's rough handling when they'd insisted on taking her badge first, their hands gripping her arm harder than necessary as they guided her toward the exit like she was a problem that needed removing. Shoppers stared. Some recognized her from the news. The clip had circulated through the mall staff, the one where she was standing next to that man in the wheelchair, that paralyzed veteran, and Sterling was talking about liability and wheelchair traffic and the premium shoppers who didn't want to see that kind of thing. Cameras had caught it. Phones had recorded it. The internet had done what the internet does. But seeing her live, actually watching her walk out with a cardboard box of her life in her hands, was different. It was real. It was public. It was the kind of humiliation that didn't need words. One woman actually turned away, as if looking at Katie directly might contaminate her. A teenager pointed. The security guard's boots echoed on the marble floor, the click, 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 the sound of authority removing something it had decided was unwanted. Katie's jaw worked quietly, the muscles tight against her teeth, but her face remained still. There was a composure in that walk, in the way she held the box, in the fact that she didn't quicken her pace or slow it. She moved like someone who had learned long ago that breaking down in public was a luxury reserved for people with somewhere private to go. The main entrance doors were glass, and the afternoon light hit them like a wall of exposure. Outside, the Houston heat was thick enough to breathe, the kind of wet oppressive warmth that made everything feel heavier. Katie's damp scrubs clung to her skin. The parking lot stretched out in every direction, endless asphalt radiating back the sun. The security guard stayed just inside the glass threshold, watching until she was far enough away that she couldn't come back. That was the protocol. Remove the problem, confirm it stays removed. She didn't go home. Home was an apartment that didn't know her name, really, just rent paid on time by a direct deposit from a job that had just ended. Instead, Katie found herself driving toward Washington Cemetery, following the turns with the kind of muscle memory that meant her mind could go somewhere else. The roads were familiar because she'd driven them every week for 6 months, always at the same time, always alone, always with the same question she never asked out loud. The rain started at 3:22 p.m., the kind of summer rain that came without warning, without promise, just precipitation that didn't care if anyone wanted it. Katie stood in front of a headstone with her cardboard box at her feet and her damp scrubs clinging to her shoulders, and the rain came down like applause from a crowd that wasn't there. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Morrison. 1987 to 2019. Beloved. The word felt like an accusation. I promised you, Katie whispered. The rain hammered harder, as if the sky was trying to drown out her words. I promised you I'd keep fighting for them. I promised you that separating, that disappearing, that it meant I was finally going to heal, finally going to stop being broken. That I'd find a way to matter again without carrying the rifle. Her voice didn't break. Her hands didn't shake. But water ran down her face that wasn't just rain. I couldn't even last a year, Marcus. I couldn't last 6 months. One man making a bet about whether I'd quit, and I'm standing in the rain at your grave like I failed you. Like I failed all of them. The gravestone didn't answer. Gravestones never did. Katie turned back toward the parking lot, the box still in her hands, and that was when she noticed something she hadn't before. A car pulling into the cemetery access road. Not routine. Not the kind of place that got much traffic on a Tuesday afternoon. An older model sedan, pale blue, moving slowly as if the driver was reading grave markers. Katie watched from a distance as a man in his mid-40s stepped out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying pain in his body. His gait was wrong, compensation for a previous injury, left leg taking less weight. He wore a VA Medical Center badge on his collar. Katie didn't think. She moved back toward the headstone, suddenly aware that she was standing in a stranger's private grief, that the rain was washing her away in real time, that some people carried their damage more visibly than others. The man nodded respectfully as he approached a grave 3 rows over. He didn't look at her. That was mercy. That was understanding. That was everything Dr. Sterling didn't have. 2 days passed. Katie didn't go to Mercy General. She didn't check her emails. She sat in her apartment with the cardboard box on the kitchen counter and pretended that disappearing meant you could actually disappear, that walking away from something was the same as leaving it behind. But on Thursday morning, around 8:27 a.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was older, cultured, speaking English with the careful precision of someone for whom it wasn't a first language. "Is this Katie?" The nurse at the mall clinic. A moment of silence. Then, "My name is Bashir Ahmadi. I have an intake appointment this morning. I was told to call if I was running late." Katie's throat tightened. She didn't recognize the name. She didn't remember scheduling this person. She almost hung up. Instead, she said, "I'll be there," and ended the call. What she didn't know was that Bashir Ahmadi was walking into that clinic with 43 years of history, with an infected surgical wound that needed attention, with paperwork from the VA refugee resettlement program that had brought him to Houston just 6 weeks earlier. What she didn't know was that he'd spent the last 2 days asking every veteran he met if they'd ever heard of a nurse named Katie who worked at the Galleria clinic, that someone had finally said yes, that he'd made the appointment on purpose, that recognition was about to shatter everything she'd buried. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the moment Bashir Ahmadi saw her face during intake, really saw her, beyond the scrubs and the name badge and the tired eyes, his entire body went rigid. His hand started trembling. And he said, very quietly, in Pashto first and then in English, words that Katie Morrison had spent 6 months trying to make sure no one would ever speak to her again. "You're her. You're the one. Senior Chief. You're alive." 2 weeks later, James Reeves rolled through the Galleria's main entrance with his daughter Sarah flanking one side of his wheelchair, a Navy lieutenant in dress blues, her shoulders squared with the kind of posture that made shoppers instinctively step back. Behind them came 6 figures in VA polo shirts and one man in a charcoal suit who carried himself like someone accustomed to moving through rooms and having them reorganize themselves. The security team Katie had faced on her last day was nowhere to be found. Different guards now stood at the mall service corridors, younger ones, their expressions carefully neutral. Sarah moved with the precision of someone who had learned to navigate bureaucracies and hostile territories in equal measure. She found Katie in the clinic's front office, processing paperwork for an afternoon intake, and the moment their eyes met, Katie's hand stopped moving. She didn't stand. She didn't speak. The trembling wasn't fear. It was recognition of something shifting in the gravitational field of her own life, something she had buried so deep that even she had forgotten how to reach it. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison," Sarah said, and the voice carried the weight of official acknowledgement, "My father insists you be present for this." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the respect of one warrior recognizing another. Katie's chest tightened. No one had called her that in 3 years. No one had known to call her that. Sarah extended a military service file across the desk, and Katie's fingers moved on their own, muscle memory from a life that was supposed to be over. The file was thin, which meant the story it contained had been carefully curated. She read the name first, Bashir Ahmadi, and then the designation, Afghan National Army Interpreter, attached to Forward Operating Base Shank, Logar Province, 2012 to 2014. Her eyes tracked down the page, and there it was, documented in sparse military prose, present at Ambush, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, June 14, 2012. Witness to medical intervention by SFOD Delta Senior Chief Morrison. 12 soldiers recovered. Mission classified. 12 soldiers. The number didn't trigger a memory because the memory had been locked away, sealed in a compartment labeled * do not open *. But now, reading it in official typeface, Katie felt the compartment's lock begin to crack. "He's here," Sarah said softly. "He arrived in Houston 3 weeks ago. Resettlement from the interpreter program. He came to the clinic looking for medical care, and Dr. Torres recognized the name on his intake form." Sarah paused, letting the weight of that moment settle. "He didn't come here to ask for anything, Senior Chief. He came to make sure you knew he was alive." Through the clinic's window, Katie could see a man in his early 40s, thin-faced, with the peculiar stillness of someone who had survived by becoming invisible. He stood with James Reeves in the mall's food court, exactly where the teenagers had laughed 14 days earlier, exactly where the world had briefly tilted off its axis and Katie had chosen dignity over rage. The next voice she heard came not from Sarah, but from a man in a navy dress uniform who stepped forward from the contingent behind them. His uniform carried 5 rows of ribbons, and his collar bore the insignia of a SEAL team leader. "Senior Chief Morrison," he said, and then he opened a leather folder and began to read aloud, his voice carrying across the small clinic like a ceremony being performed for an audience of one. "Bronze Star with Valor." He paused. Reaction was optional. Katie gave none. "Bronze Star with Valor." Another pause. The same careful spacing between medals and silence. "Silver Star." His voice deepened on that one, because the Silver Star was the kind of medal that changed how people stood in rooms. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." Katie's eye stayed fixed on a point 3 inches above his left shoulder. This was how you survived having your identity read aloud in a shopping mall. You disappeared inside yourself and became a vessel for the words being spoken about you, words that belonged to someone else, someone you used to be. Placing herself repeatedly in direct enemy fire to provide emergency medical intervention. 12 soldiers returned to combat effectiveness as a result of her actions. Citation dated June 16, 2012. Presented by General Christopher Petraeus. The SEAL team leader closed the folder. "Welcome home, Senior Chief," he said. But that wasn't the worst part, or perhaps it was the best part, depending on how you measured things. Because at that exact moment, while the SEAL team leader's words were still settling into the air like dust after an explosion, 2 men in dark FBI windbreakers appeared at the clinic's entrance, holding a printed warrant and wearing the expression of people who had been waiting for this moment to arrive. Behind them came the mall's ownership board, led by Gerald Hutchins himself, the man who had listened to Sterling's threats on the phone 14 days earlier and chosen ambition over integrity. Hutchins's face was the color of old concrete. "Dr. Richard Sterling is being taken into federal custody," one of the FBI agents announced, his voice clear and procedural. "Charges include embezzlement of charitable funds, tax fraud, and money laundering. The amount totals $47,316, drawn from the Galleria's Veteran Memorial donation boxes over an 18-month period." The agent's partner was already moving toward Sterling's office, the warrant unfolding like a predator's wing. Security footage would later show Sterling trying to delete files on his personal computer, his hands moving with the frantic precision of someone who had suddenly realized that the walls he'd built weren't walls at all, they were paper screens, and they had been burning from the inside the whole time. The escort to his office took 4 minutes. The escort out of the mall took 7. The same security guard who had handed Katie her belongings in a cardboard box 14 days earlier, her name tag, her employee handbook, her dignity compressed into brown craft paper, now performed the same action in reverse. He stood in Sterling's office doorway with perfect posture and said, "I believe you know the way out, sir," and handed him an identical cardboard box containing his personal items from his desk. The guard's voice held no judgment. That was what made it devastation. Judgment could have been argued with. Neutrality was a death sentence. Sterling's hand shook as he reached for the box. The perp walk happened at 4:17 p.m., right in the center of the Galleria's main food court, at the precise intersection where James Reeves's wheelchair had stopped 2 weeks earlier and where teenagers had laughed and where Katie had chosen to stand with her back straight. The handcuffs caught the afternoon light coming through the skylights, and for just a moment, Sterling's eyes found hers across the crowd that had gathered. There was no recognition in those eyes anymore, no contempt, no certainty. There was only the look of someone watching his entire constructed world collapse into its component pieces. The elderly man Katie had saved, the one whose tension pneumothorax had required a needle decompression with a 14-gauge angiocath while Sterling stood uselessly beside the fountain, stood in the crowd with his family, and he applauded. Just 3 soft claps. That was all that was needed. Others joined in, not loudly, but with the weight of people who understood that they had just witnessed something shift beneath the foundations of how the world worked. Bashir Ahmadi stepped forward then, and he placed his hand over his heart and bowed slightly toward Katie, the gesture from his culture, the one that acknowledged a debt that transcended language. Behind him stood 11 others, the 12 soldiers, minus one who had been killed in a convoy ambush 3 months after the Sanjin Valley incident. They had flown in for this. They had taken military leave and gotten on flights and traveled to Houston because one of them had tracked down the woman who had saved their lives, and she had been sweeping floors and taking abuse and pretending to be ordinary. Katie's voice, when she finally spoke, carried across the marble atrium with the kind of quiet authority that made people stop moving. "Thank you for honoring a promise that was never supposed to be kept," she said to Sarah, to the SEAL team leader, to Bashir Ahmadi, to the 12 soldiers who had flown 1,000 miles to stand in a shopping mall and bear witness to the woman who had held them together when they were breaking. "But this isn't about me. This is about making sure that men like James Reeves don't have to sit in a food court and be laughed at while people walk past. This is about making sure that when the next person in uniform walks into this mall, they're treated with the dignity they've earned." 6 months later, Katie Morrison's nameplate read, Director, Galleria Veterans Resource Center. The center occupied 3,000 square feet on the mall's second level, funded by the $47,000 recovered from Sterling's fraud and matched by private donations that had arrived in waves after a local news station broke the full story. The walls were painted the color of dawn over a desert, warm and golden, and the furniture was arranged in configurations that allowed privacy for the people who came in carrying things they couldn't name. On the wall behind her desk hung a shadow box made of dark walnut, and inside it lay a faded Special Forces unit patch, the same one that had been sewn into the lining of her jacket on the day the teenagers laughed, waiting through all those months of silence to finally be seen. Beside it hung Marcus's Marine Corps flag, folded into its ceremonial triangle, and her Silver Star citation, the lettering barely visible now, but the intent preserved forever. James Reeves worked 3 days a week at the center as a peer counselor, his wheelchair rolling through the corridors with the confident ease of someone who had stopped seeing limitations and started seeing doors. Dr. Torres had transferred to the center 6 months after Katie's reinstatement, and he now served as the medical director, the man who had recognized Bashir Ahmadi's name on a simple intake form and understood immediately what it meant. On a Tuesday afternoon, a young veteran in a wheelchair entered the resource center, his uniform creases still sharp from recent discharge, his eyes carrying the specific kind of exhaustion that came from having survived something the civilian world had no framework for understanding. He looked lost in the way that people look lost when they're surrounded by maps but none of them show where they actually are. Katie met him at the door and knelt to eye level, the way she had learned to move with James Reeves months earlier, the way that said, "Your height does not determine your importance in this room." "Welcome home," she said. "How can we help?" The veteran, barely 23, pointed at the shadow box visible through the clinic window. "Are you really her? The guardian angel? The one from Kandahar?" Katie glanced at the faded patch, then back at him, and when she spoke, her voice carried the specific gravity of someone who had finally stopped running from her own story. "I'm a nurse who knows exactly what it's like to come home and not know how to ask for help. Let's start there." As she wheeled him toward the intake desk, she passed through the atrium where the fountain still flowed, where shoppers still moved through their days, where the world continued with its beautiful, ordinary indifference. But something had shifted. The light fell differently on the memorial wall now, the one that displayed photographs of local veterans, including Marcus Morrison in his Marine Corps dress blues, and the 12 men from Kandahar, their faces young and alive and forever preserved in the place where they had once been forgotten. Katie paused at that wall and placed her hand briefly against Marcus's photo, the way she did every single day, a small ritual of remembering and continuing. Then she turned back to the young veteran and said, "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to keep showing up for the people who need you. That's the fight that matters now." If you found Katie's story compelling, I hope you'll subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us about a time when you were underestimated and proved everyone wrong. These stories matter because they remind us that the quietest people in the room might just be carrying the heaviest weight. Thanks for watching.